In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery today is former Prime Minister, the Honourable Dr Kevin Rudd AC and Ms Therese Rain. A warm welcome to you both. I'm also pleased to inform the House that present in the galleries today are a distinguished delegation of members of the United States Congress and accompanying officials. With them is the Honourable Tony Smith, former Speaker of the House. On behalf of the House, welcome to the Australian Parliament and question time. And I give the call to the Acting Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I inform the House that the Leader of the Opposition will be absent from question time today for personal reasons, and I will be representing the Leader in question time.
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On indulgence, I have accepted an invitation from President Joe Biden to undertake an official visit to the United States from the 23rd to the 26th of October. I'm deeply honoured to accept the President's invitation on behalf of all Australians. Our alliance with the United States has long been at the heart of our foreign policy. For generations now, we have worked together in service of our shared ideals. As partners for peace, for security and stability in the Indo-Pacific, but in the wider world as well. And for all the profound history that we share, the future of the relationship offers us a greater world of opportunity. I look forward to building on the constructive discussions I've had with the President in our previous meetings, including advancing ambitious climate action and the transition to clean energy under the historic agreement that we came into in Japan, the Climate, Critical Minerals and Clean Energy Transformation Compact. Of course, this visit is also a valuable opportunity for Australia and the United States to build on the AUKUS agreement that we announced in San Diego earlier this year, deepening the opportunities in research, science and technology, in local manufacturing and in even closer defence cooperation in our region. And of course, Operation Malabar, along with Japan, India and the United States, will be taking place this weekend as well. On the subject of cooperation, I know that the whole House would join me in thanking the United States Armed Forces for the assistance that they provided in the recovery following those tragic events off Hamilton Island. I welcome as well the esteemed members of the US Congress who are present in the chamber today. You are very welcome visitors here to our nation. I look forward to meeting with you later today at the Lodge, but then meeting with you as well in the United States of America, in your homeland. You are welcome guests here in our country. I also take the opportunity to welcome our Ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, and Therese Rain, to congratulate Kevin on the unveiling of his portrait this morning, and thank all those members, including the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, for their attendance at what was a great celebration here in this House. I consider President Biden's invitation a great honour, not for myself, but it's about who we represent. Our great nations is a friendship between Australia and the United States. I very much look forward to representing Australia in the United States in Washington DC. During the visit as well, we will be opening or reopening the new refurbished Australian Embassy there in Washington DC.
On indulgence, I call the Acting Leader.
On indulgence, Mr Speaker, can I associate the opposition most strongly with the Prime Minister's remarks and note that the US is our strongest ally. The AUKUS initiative delivered under us is vital to our national security future. We wish the Prime Minister well on his visit, and once again we associate the opposition with all that he has just stated, including the warm welcome to Kevin Rudd. It was a pleasure, former Prime Minister Rudd, to be at the unveiling of your statue earlier today. Well done.
We'll move to questions without notice. Are there any questions without notice? And I give the call to the Acting Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been a member of this House for almost 30 years and now lives a privileged life in the Lodge and Kirribilli House. He has never dealt with the challenge of accessing healthcare in regional and remote Australia. Why is this arrogant Prime Minister pursuing a reckless policy which will close pharmacies and deprive Australians of vital access to healthcare? How on earth can Australians get cheaper medicines from their local pharmacy if that pharmacy closes?
I give the call. Order. Members will not interject while members are asking questions. Order. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her question. And it's true that I do not live in regional Australia. I do live in Australia's largest inland city, the one we're in right now, of Canberra. And it's true that, like the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, all of us in this chamber live a life of relative privilege compared with the people that we represent. That is right, which is precisely why we need to do whatever we can to look after people and to address cost of living pressures, which is why the 60-day dispensing is aimed precisely at that, precisely at doing that, precisely at making sure that instead of having to go twice to the pharmacy, one on day 30, one on day 60. If you go once, you are cutting the price literally on half, as well as taking pressure off the medical system by having to have less journeys to the doctor. And the
Acting Leader has asked the question. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence, as she was heard in silence when she asked the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was pleased yesterday to read a press release from the Shadow Health Minister, and I thought the party that have been obsessed by saying no to everything were about to have that kumbaya moment, and we're about to say something positive. It began. The Coalition strongly supports Australians having access to cheaper medicines. Strongly supports. Excellent.
Order.
And then it went on to say in the very next sentence,
of the Nationals,
we support 60-day dispensing. Oh, wow, this is going well. That's the way. And then I read the next word. However. Even though we support it all, we're against it. And what we'll do is we'll put in a disallowance motion in the Senate. We'll hold a press conference with all the drama, the Nats and the Libs out there. We're going to knock it over tomorrow.
Order.
And you know what they did in the Senate earlier today? They lost 6 votes trying to block the vote being held. Trying to block the vote being held on their motion. On their motion. And then, when that all failed, they withdrew the moving of the motion. Oh. So now it sits on the notice paper an orphan. No one's moving it. No one's associated with it.
Order.
What a farce.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals will cease interjecting, so will the member for Gellibrand. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How is the Albanese Labor government addressing the challenges it inherited to put nurses back into nursing homes and improve the care for older Australians?
I give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Wills for his question. Mr Speaker, today is a milestone day for Australia's aged care sector. The Albanese government has put nurses back into nursing homes. The Aged Care Royal Commission into Quality and Safety told a shocking story of neglect, of inaction and a lack of ambition under the now opposition. And one of those Commission's key findings was that there were unacceptable staffing levels which were creating a horrific environment of substandard care. And the Commission recommended care minute targets and 24/7 nursing in response to make sure that aged care residents could get the clinical care that they required around the clock, day or night. And those opposite refused to commit to 24/7 nursing in government for 15 long months.
Shameful.
They believed that just 2/3 of that would suffice, because apparently from their view emergencies just never happen at night.
No.
So why plan for it? But this side of the House understood the importance of round-the-clock care, and that is why we ambitiously brought forward this deadline by a year. And earlier today we released the first data for nursing coverage in July. And on average, Mr Speaker, there was a nurse on site in aged care facilities 98% of the time.
Yeah, great job.
Let me just state that again. In our very first month, with 24/7 requirements, that has led to a registered nurse on site in aged care homes 23.5 hours a day.
Excellent work.
Now, we hope this will improve over coming months. Taking on workforce shortages in aged care has been a huge effort across the entire new Labor government. Minister Giles with the industry labour agreements and speeding up visa processing times, Minister O'Connor and fee-free tape, Minister O'Neill and student visas, Minister Clare and university places, Minister Burke and the work value case, the Treasurer and Minister Gallagher with an $11.3 billion aged care pay rise, and Minister Butler and the Prime Minister, who have always put aged care at the heart of our reform agenda.
That's right.
And we've done this despite the naysayers across the chamber. And I know those opposite are very disappointed that the sky did not fall in on 1 July.
Manager of Opposition Business will cease
met
injecting.
our ambition with great scepticism. Scepticism they still to seem possessed today, despite the fact that today they are witnessing 98% nursing coverage in aged care facilities across the country. They didn't even bother to try. They didn't even bother to measure. But we've done both, and here we stand with aged care in a better position in this country than it ever's been.
Give the call to the honourable member for Fisher.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 31st of July, the Montville pharmacy in my electorate of Fisher was forced to close as a direct result of the increased costs of doing business and in anticipation of the commencement of Labor's community pharmacy
The member for Fisher
changes.
will resume his seat. Order. Members on my right, the Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister for Water and the Minister for Indigenous Australians, I've been pretty clear about listening to members and being heard in silence. Out of respect for the member for Fisher, he will begin his question again and there will be silence on my right. The member for Fisher has the call.
Prime Minister, on the 31st of July, the Montville pharmacy in my electorate of Fisher was forced to close as a direct result of the increased costs of doing business and in anticipation of the commencement of Labor's community pharmacy changes. Montville has also recently just lost its only doctor. Prime Minister, how will the people of Montville and rural and regional towns across the country obtain access to cheaper medicines when there are no community pharmacies left in the bush to dispense them?
Give a call to the Prime Minister. Order.
Thanks very much, Mr.
Members
Speaker.
on my left.
I note the nature of the question from the member opposite. These changes come in from September. But what he's saying is,
Order.
somehow.
Order. The member for Fisher has asked the question.
And they
I can't hear the Prime Minister.
And the changes also.
The member for Deakin and the member for Hume, I can't hear what the Prime Minister is saying.
The changes also, if he had followed the debate, he would know that just 1/3 of the changes come in September as well. And then there's a further change in March, I think, if that's correct, of next year.
Order.
And then a further change 6 months later on. And I myself have met with the Pharmacy Guild, along with other pharmacists in my own electorate about these issues. And that's why we're continuing to have discussions and why the Health Minister announced additional support as well for pharmacies as part of the program. It's important. It's important here.
Acting leader. The acting leader will cease interjecting, please.
It's important as well here to recognise that this is about making a difference on cost of living. The idea that you deliberately keep costs to consumers high as a conscious strategy, frankly, is one that I believe is indefensible. And that's why it was recommended to those opposite in 2018 that be the case. The fact is that this is about cheaper medicine for 6 million Australians. And if those opposite want to stand for more expensive medicines for 6 million Australians, then let them know that that is the case. 6 million Australians, people in cities, people in regions, will all pay for this policy. But yet again undermining the PBS, yet again pushing up the cost of living for millions of Australians, yet again. The Liberal Party never missing a chance to try and make Australians pay more for the health care that they need. Never missing a chance. We on this side will always stand up for help with the cost of living, and will always be the party of cheaper medicine as well.
The member for Macarthur is warned. Order. Far too much noise on my left. That continues. People will be warned. One warning. After that, you'll remove yourself under 94A. I'll hear from the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why is it so important that the Albanese Labor government delivers cost of living relief for millions of Australians through cheaper medicines? What obstacles are there in delivering this relief?
Give the call to the Minister for Health.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Hawke, part of this terrifically talented new generation that was elected to the Labor benches at the last election. He, along with all of those members, promised Australians cheaper medicines at the last election, Mr Speaker, and in just 12 months we've already delivered 3 waves of cheaper medicines reform that will save Australian patients hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But we know there is more to do, Mr Speaker, and that's why we accepted the advice of the medicines experts who manage the PBS to allow doctors to issue 60-day prescriptions for common medicines for ongoing health conditions at the price of a 30-day script, halving the cost of these ongoing medicines for 6 million Australian patients, Mr Speaker. It's not only good for their hip pocket, it's also good for their health, because we know from overseas evidence it will improve medication compliance and it will free up millions of GP consults that are so desperately needed out there in the community. So good for the cost of living and good for health. That's why so many other countries to which we would usually compare ourselves already do this, already allow 60 or even 90-day scripts, Mr Speaker, and that's why we've received such strong support for this measure from every single patient group and every doctors group in the country. But I'm asked about obstacles, Mr Speaker. And the first thing to say about that is, as the Prime Minister just said, this is not new advice. This same advice was delivered by the same experts to the former government 5 years ago, and they did nothing. They chose to support the pharmacy lobby over the interest of patients. And as a result, those patients have shelled out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in fees that they didn't have to pay. Now, you can say a lot of things about those opposite, Mr Speaker, but at least they're consistent, because yesterday they lodged a motion to block access for cheaper medicines to 6 million patients. Yet again, once again, backing the lobby, over the interests of patients. Exactly, frankly, what you would expect from a party led by a man who was Health Minister, tried to jack up the price of medicines by $5 a script. Well, Mr Speaker, we know how important cheaper medicines are at a time of a global cost of living shock for millions and millions of patients. And we know how important it is to free up the health system after the pressures of 3 years of pandemic. And whatever the Coalition and One Nation try to do over in the Senate, Mr Speaker, we are determined, with or without the Coalition's support, to deliver cheaper medicines to Australian patients.
Give the call to the honourable member for Griffith.
To the Minister for Climate Change, your government has approved 3 new coal projects and supports new gas. However, the International Energy Agency has been clear that in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, no country can open any new coal and gas, while the International Institute for Sustainable Development has said there is a large consensus that new oil and gas fields are incompatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Can the minister explain whether the government supports these findings, and if so, how can he justify new coal and gas?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and I thank him for the opportunity to talk about everything this government has done over the last 15 months in relation to acting on climate change after 10 years of denial and delay. And the honourable member quotes the IEA. The IEA is a very important organisation, Mr Speaker. A very important
The member for Fairfax.
And if the honourable member is going to quote the IEA, he's very entitled to do that. He should quote the IEA in full, in all their views about all things, including carbon capture and storage, for example, Mr Speaker, which is not a view I think the honourable member shares and would not quote the IEA in that regard. But in relation to climate change, Mr Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that this government has finally given Australia a Climate Change Act with a significant increase in the targets, Mr Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact we brought the Climate Change Authority back to give independent advice to the government of the day, as it should, in a transparent way, Mr Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact we've changed the objectives of the CFC and ARENA and so many other government organisations to actually finally put us on track for zero emissions, Mr Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that we've funded $20 billion in rewiring the nation to upgrade our energy grid, because there's no transition without transmission, Mr Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that we're improving, including today, community engagement on that transmission, Mr Speaker. I'm very proud of that fact. Maybe things the honourable member doesn't support.
The minister, the member for Herbert is warned. And I will call, I'll call the member for Griffith, who has the call now.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the question went specifically to coal and gas and whether the government accepts the findings of the IEA and other bodies that have said we can't have new coal and gas. Coal and gas once in that entire question.
Well, the minister is entitled to be directly relevant to the question. There are a number of parts to the question. He can answer as he sees fit, but I'll listen to him carefully to make sure he is being relevant. So far, he is talking about the subject matter in the question, and he still has 1 minute 30 remaining. The minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, because this government believes in a holistic approach to climate change. The honourable member likes to pick out this project or that project. He doesn't actually acknowledge the sweeping reforms that this government is putting into place, like finally ensuring Australia has an offshore wind industry in Australia, Mr Speaker, declaring the first 2 zones and beginning the process for more.
Barker.
For actually delivering a capacity investment scheme to drive gigawatts of renewable energy investment across this country, something those opposite promised and never delivered. To actually give the safeguard reforms teeth, to actually drive reforms that will be the equivalent of 2/3 of Australia's cars' emissions between now and 2030. And while talking about cars, the Minister for Transport and I driving a fuel efficiency standard so Australia finally catches up with the rest of the world and has a fleet which is low and no emissions and stops being the only major economy apart from Russia without fuel efficiency standards, something the previous government left us with.
Will cease interjecting.
I'm proud of the fact we've signed the Global Methane Pledge and joined the Climate Club, Mr Speaker, both well overdue as well, Mr Speaker. I'm proud of the fact we've passed the electric vehicle discount, which has driven an uptake in our short time in office so far of electric vehicles from 2% to 8%.
Member for O'Connor will
I saw a
cease
shadow
interjecting.
minister on television the other day saying Electric vehicle sales were going through the roof under the coalition. Must have been a very low roof, Mr Speaker. A very low roof indeed, because they did nothing for 10 years and we're fixing up the mess.
When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Reid.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government working to restore dignity to the aged care sector?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Reid for her question and for her concern for the people just a little bit further west than me in her electorate of Reid, and particularly the elderly people in that fine electorate. Of course, there are a range of aged care facilities in Burwood, in Concord, in Five Dock, in all of those communities, including ethnically specific aged care centres for the Chinese community and for the Italian community and others. After a decade of neglect and a Royal Commission that was titled Neglect, titled Neglect, a Royal Commission that they established, where they appointed the commissioners, titled its interim report Neglect. We needed to have more carers with more time to care. It's a commitment that we took to the election to restore dignity to aged care. I think that most Australians would think that nurses should be in nursing homes, that this was not a radical policy, but a sensible common sense policy. And we said that we would get nurses back in aged care 24/7. And today the results are in. On average, just after this began in July, there is a registered nurse on site 98% of the time. 86% of facilities already have a nurse on site 24/7, and on average there is a registered nurse on site in aged care homes for 23.5 hours a day across the country. What that means is older Australians are getting the care that they deserve, because we changed the rules to make it happen, as well as encouraging the workforce to stay in aged care by having the 15% pay increase from July 1. 250,000 aged care workers benefiting from that. Now, of course, prior to this, we had the usual scare campaigns, Mr Speaker. The member for Farrer said, to quote, weeks out from the federal election, Anthony Albanese's key promise was to force aged care homes to have a nurse in their facility 24/7 by July this year. He sowed the seeds of the crisis that is now unfolding across the nation. The consequences are absolutely devastating.
The acting leader.
What is happening in aged care is that things off the back of their crisis are getting better, and these figures show that that is the case. They show that it's the case. With more funding, better workforce, delivering on our commitments and ensuring that older Australians have the dignity and care that they deserve.
Order. I give the call to the honourable member for Hume.
Prime Minister, since Labor came to government, interest rates have gone up 11 times. Core inflation is amongst the highest of advanced economies. Real wages have fallen off a cliff. Consumer confidence is tanking, and economic growth is half the OECD average. The result is Australians are working harder for less. Will the Prime Minister admit that under a Labor, Australians are worse off?
Order. Order. Members on my right. The Minister for Health. The Treasurer will cease interjecting as well. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, it is good. I congratulate the Shadow Treasurer on getting a question on the economy this week. It doesn't go to the Treasurer, but I'm happy to step in. And once again, we saw the catastrophising from those opposite. Those opposite who always want to talk down Australia and talk down our economy.
Order. The member for Hume has asked his question.
The facts are these. the highest inflation rate this century was on their watch at 2.1% in the March 2022 quarter.
Order.
The inflation rate in the last quarter was 0.8. 0.8 or
Order.
2.1. Unemployment when we came to office was 3.9. Now it's 3.5. Fact. Women employed full-time, 3.9 million under us. Under the previous government, 3.6 million. Fact. Long-term unemployed, 133,000 under them, 100,000 under us. Fact. Industrial disputes,
Order.
Mr Speaker, 128,000 days lost in the last quarter in which they held office. Remember, Australia was going to stop if the industrial relations legislation went through. What's the figure for March quarter of this year? 7,700. Fact. Fact. Annual wage growth was 2.4% under them, 3.7% under us. Private business investment, 10.8 under them, the March quarter.
The acting leader of the opposition will cease interjecting.
Under us. And of course, taxes. Taxes under their year, 2021-22, 23.2%, lower under us as a percentage of GDP. But the doozy, Mr Speaker, is the budget. $78 billion deficit under them, a surplus of around $20 billion under us. Responsible economic management, making a difference, something that those opposite who promised a surplus in their first year and every year thereafter didn't deliver in the whole decade.
Order. There's far too much noise on my left. A general warning has now been issued for members. That level of noise will not continue. Okay. Give the call to the member for Chisholm.
Thank you so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What policy approaches has the Albanese Labor government changed to better support our aged care workforce?
Give the call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Chisholm for the question and for her commitment in improving aged care and improving working conditions for people. Both the former government and this government were presented with the same information by the Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission finding, and I quote, was the evidence is clear that the quality of care and the quality of jobs in aged care are inextricably linked. Australia's aged care is understaffed and the workforce underpaid, and going on to say that there are other reasons why the sector as a whole has had difficulties attracting and retaining well-skilled people to work in aged care. These include low wages. So, presented with that information, there were two different approaches as to how you deal with the aged care workforce, because it was clear that if you don't have enough staff, you end up with residents who need more significant treatment. Per day in aged care costs $200 to $300. Per day in hospital costs $2,000. Not just neglect of the aged care residents, but neglect of the workforce. Punish the workforce, punish the residents, and cost the budget more. So there were two approaches as to how you handle this. The approach from those opposite was just give a couple of one-off payments. One-off payments of $800, which were not well administered, and people don't go back to a workforce on a permanent basis because there's going to be a one-off payment. They want to know what's happening in pay rates overall. The Fair Work value case was being held. Under the previous government, the decision was it would not turn up and ask for a pay rise. Our decision was we went with a submission that said the Commonwealth supports a minimum wage increase for aged care workers. Under them, they refused to tell the Fair Work Commission whether the government would actually fund an increase.
The Minister will pause. The member for Deakin has been continually interjecting after I gave a general warning, which I said there'd be actions for. So the action now is that you will leave the chamber under 94A. Just ask the minister to continue.
Thanks, Speaker. They refused to say they'd fund a pay rise. We put in a submission that said the Commonwealth will provide funding to support any increases to award wages. What difference did that make? It meant a 15% pay rise was awarded. It meant for a level 4 direct care employee, they now earn more than $5 an hour extra. That's nearly $200 extra a week. That's more than $10,000 extra a year. And that's why we are now seeing people being able to be retained and returning to the workforce and choosing to be trained for the workforce. It was the Deputy Leader, now today the Acting Leader, who said there are concerns out there today about the actual collapse of the aged care system as we know it. Well, what we have seen is now there are nurses in nursing homes. 98% compliance.
Order. The minister's time has concluded, and I'll call the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's answer to my question in June, where he committed to working with the New South Wales Government on the flood recovery of devastated communities in central West New South Wales. Can the Prime Minister update the House on whether the Resilient Homes program will be offered to families in the Central West who have now been living in temporary accommodation for almost 9 months?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question, and we have had discussions with New South Wales. Indeed, the Minister, Minister Watt, is convening a meeting of all national emergency ministers in the coming month. Just this morning, we signed off on some further support for people who have been victims of natural disasters to make sure that that support flows. We'll continue to engage with New South Wales as well as with other state governments. I will report back. I will speak directly to the Leader of the National Party, because I know that he's very sincere in his commitment there. Frankly, the response has left communities I know in the central west of New South Wales. I've had discussions with the member for Clare about these issues as well. I know that in Lismore as well there's still people doing it really tough. And there we had a whole program, for example, of buying people out who were on floodplains who shouldn't be remaining there because they just couldn't return to those homes. These issues are complex. I'll continue to work, though, with people across the chamber, as I do, on these issues, and I will engage directly with the honourable member opposite.
Give the call to the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government helping to ease cost of living pressures on Australian families and small businesses, and what barriers are there to that support being delivered?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Dunkley for her question. That's her first question to me this week about the cost of living, but it's more than the Shadow Treasurer has asked me this week. This side of the House, Mr Speaker, we understand Australians are under pressure from a combination of moderating but still too high inflation and higher interest rates and the impact of global turbulence. And that's why this Prime Minister and this government's highest priority is rolling out billions of dollars in cost of living help for Australians doing it tough. And we're doing that in a way that takes some of the edge off these cost of living pressures without adding to inflation in our economy. And we're doing that by targeting the relief to where the pressures are most acute, like rent and out-of-pocket health costs and electricity. And we're doing that at the same time as we're getting the budget in much better nick, as the Prime Minister said, a $100 billion turnaround in the cash balance for last year, and we're investing in the foundations of a stronger economy and a better future for more of our people. Now, when we came to office, quarterly inflation was higher, unemployment was higher, deficits were bigger, debt was higher, and that was costing Australians more in interest. And our responsible economic management is seeing some progress made. But we know that times are still tough, our economy will soften and the pressures on the budget are intensifying rather than easing. But it remains the case, Mr Speaker, that the wasted decade presided over by those opposite made Australians more vulnerable to the shocks that are coming at us from around the world.
The Treasurer will pause. The acting Leader of the Opposition is getting closer, maybe a bit far away, but I'm hearing her louder and louder. So I've just asked her to cease interjecting for the remainder of this answer. Give a call to the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, those opposite made a mess of the economy and a mess of the budget, and now they are refusing to help us clean it up.
Order.
They were part of the problem when it comes to the economy, and now they refuse to be part of the solution. And we know that because at almost every turn they have tried to block our efforts to help people through difficult times. They had a chance to vote for caps on gas prices. Instead, they voted for higher energy prices. They had a chance to help people with their electricity bills, and instead they voted for higher electricity bills. They had a chance to help people with the cost of their medicines. Instead, they want to vote for even more expensive medicine for people with chronic conditions. They had a chance to help build more homes. Instead, they voted for fewer homes and therefore higher rents. Mr Speaker, if those opposite really understood the pressures that people are under, they wouldn't have voted again and again against helping them with their energy costs and their medicine costs, and they wouldn't have hidden, as the member for Hume did, the higher electricity costs from the Australian public. Now, Mr Speaker, if those opposite had any economic credibility whatsoever, they would acknowledge that rates were rising and quarterly inflation peaked back when the member for Hume was the worst minister in the worst government since Federation. If they had any credibility, they would acknowledge that inflation's moderating, we've got billions of dollars of help rolling out, we've got the first surplus in 15 years, and we've got 500,000 jobs created on our watch. Cost of living is the highest priority of this government, even if those opposite couldn't give a stuff.
Concluded. I'll hear from the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. For 8 years, the Kimba community in my electorate pursued an invitation to host the National Radioactive Waste Management Facility. As with Israel and other upcoming issues at Labor Party's national conference, is Labor's decision to scrap this facility yet another example of the bitter internal backroom Labor factional deal being prioritised over the national interest?
The member will just resume his seat for a moment. Yeah, I'll hear from the leader. Order. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, in practice there's a blanket prohibition on questions about party conferences.
There is. So I'll just ask the member for Grey to assist the House to make sure the question is relevant, to remove that part of. Well, I'm trying to help the member for Grey. If he can just rephrase the question about policy, not the conference.
My question is to the Prime Minister. For 8 years, the Kimba community in my electorate pursued an invitation to host the National Radioactive Waste Management Facility. The government's decision today has left no plan for ANSTO to handle its waste in the future. What does the government plan to do with that waste when the room runs out at Lucas Heights?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Grey for his question. He was a member of the government for 3 terms, and during that period, it is correct to say that the government proposed of the day proposed Kimba as the site, and the Labor Party, under my leadership, supported the site. Supported the site.
Order. The member for Grey. Order. The member for Grey has asked the question. He will not interject.
The decision was knocked over in the Federal Court of Australia. It was knocked over because of the incompetence of the former minister in the way that he dealt with the administration of that act. it is completely the responsibility of the former government that this decision has been knocked over in the federal court.
Order. The member for Grey is seeking the court. The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. Resume your seat. The member for Grey. Order. The member for Grey will leave the chamber under 94A. Order. Members on my left. The member for Fairfax. The member for Forrest will cease interjecting. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. Minister, how is the Albanese Labor government delivering for our regional communities?
Order. Order. I have not called the minister. Reminding the member for Mitchell, he's on very thin ice. I give the call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you for that question. The member does a fantastic job representing remote Territorians, the Tiwi Islands and our external territories in Christmas and Cocos Island. Thank you very much. As a regional member, I'm incredibly proud to be part of the Albanese Labor government delivering for regional Australia. Because we know on this side of the House how important it is to back our regional businesses, our regional communities, our local councils and our farmers. And those opposite talk a big game. They deliver a lot of press releases, but they actually forget the delivery part. The Bush Summit is a great opportunity for us to come together with regional communities, with industries, with businesses, to have those direct conversations. And I know the Prime Minister is looking forward to going to Tamworth tomorrow and speaking to people at the Bush Summit there, as are my colleagues across this place who will be going to different parts of the country participating in the Bush Summit. And for my mind, I'm interested in headed to Wodonga on Tuesday next week to be part of the Bush Summit and hear firsthand from our regional communities. But time and time again, when I am out listening to regional communities, there are a couple of key themes. Number one, housing.
The member for Nichols
because it is
will
a
cease
critical
interjecting.
part of regional development. Because if you cannot provide housing, you cannot get workers, whether those be in our essential services like childcare or aged care or our teachers.
The Leader of the Nationals.
And last week I met with the Far North Queensland ROC, 10 councils from Far North Queensland who said, each and every one of them, housing is a priority for us. And that was backed in the following day when I met with Bendigo and Shepparton councils who said the same thing. The former government failed to put dollars into housing policies. They failed to deliver for regional communities. And on this side of the House, we know how important it is to deliver, which is why we have a comprehensive housing policy.
The Minister will pause. It's far too much noise on my left and right. I want to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, this answer is riddled with references to those opposite the former government. The question was, in fact, a commendably tight question. How is the Labor government delivering for our regional communities? And the minister should be directed back to the question.
The minister has been going for 2 minutes. I'm going to ask her to return to the question she was asked.
Thank you. And as I said, we went to the election with a comprehensive housing policy, and I'd urge those opposite and the Greens Party to listen to what your communities are telling you, and they're telling you to back the Housing Australia Future Fund. Connectivity is no longer a nice-to-have in our country. It's an absolute necessity. And while you talk a big game for our regional communities, you failed to deliver for our regional communities. And that's why it's taken a Labor government to deliver telecommunications and connectivity across the country. $2.2 billion in our regional connectivity plan, $2.4 billion to the NBN upgrades. That's 660,000 additional premises that will get fibre to the premises. Those opposite failed to deliver for regional Australia. And isn't it interesting that it takes a Labor government to stick up for regional Australia, say connectivity is important, deliver housing and back our regional communities?
Give the call to the member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. Last year, traditional owners on the Tiwi Islands won a landmark case in the federal court. The victory guaranteed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders the right to be consulted about offshore oil and gas projects which impact their homes and culture. However, in a meeting with Tiwi Islanders this week, they expressed to me the fear that the government will water down the required consultation process. In this year of The Voice, will the minister rule out the watering down of these consultation requirements?
Give the call to the Minister for Resources and the Minister for Northern Australia.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Tiwi Islands and their connection to their land and their sea country. I've been very clear on this issue for some time now. It is the government's position that all corners of industry, including the oil and gas sector, must genuinely consult with First Nations peoples as part of the regulatory approvals processes. All people, including First Nations people, have the right to be consulted on activities that impact them. They have a right for their voice to be heard. This was made clear by the Federal Court's judgment, and the government does accept that finding, and that's the court case that you referred to. And we are not looking to change that at all. In the last budget, the government invested $12 million for a comprehensive review of Australia's offshore oil and gas environmental regulations, with a particular focus on consultation outcomes, including for First Nations people. We want to ensure better consultation with First Nations peoples, and we want to make that a feature of the regulatory system, and we are working solidly toward that outcome. Mr Speaker, we know that there has been a distressing lack of genuine consultation and collaboration with First Nations Australians for more than 2 centuries in this country, and we aim to fix that.
The call to the honourable member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to boost connectivity for regional communities, and why is this investment needed in these areas?
Give the call to the order. Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hunter for his question. He's a passionate advocate for his region right across the portfolio. The Albanese government understands the vital role that communications services play for those living and working in regional and peri-urban Australia.
Bowman.
We've been reminded all too often through the ravages of bushfires, floods and COVID of the importance of resilient and reliable communications networks. And that's why our government is delivering the largest regional communications funding package since the inception of the NBN at over $2.2 billion. Mr Speaker, our Better Connectivity Plan is providing $656 million for regional connectivity and communications resilience, including $30 million to expand on-farm connectivity. Improving connectivity for primary producers will create more opportunities to use digital technologies to more productively and efficiently improve the safety for farmers at work. The connected technologies have brilliant practical application, from soil moisture monitoring to automated farm gates. We've also committed $1.1 billion to deliver high-speed NBN broadband with full fibre connections to 660,000 regional homes and businesses, finally fixing the copper mess left by those opposite. Mr Speaker, this morning I joined my colleague, the Minister for Regional Development, and her constituent Margot from the Jerrabomberra Residents Association, who was incredibly excited to have finally received a full fibre NBN connection. After years of advocacy, Margot was elated. In her words, today is a very special day. Margot finally has reliable, high-speed broadband with a fibre connection.
Margot runs a branding business and she often works
Order.
from home. And she explained the frustrations with her old copper connections, slow and unreliable, a legacy of the former coalition government's disastrous second-rate technology mix. And her story is one that I've heard many times across the country. Copper is less reliable, it's more expensive to maintain, and it's more likely to—
The Minister will pause. The member for Groom has been interjecting all of question time. It will leave the chamber under 94A. It is not a time to give continual interjections when the minister is on her feet. Order. I'm just going to ask the minister to return.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And they're more likely to experience prolonged faults, as Margot and her community have experienced firsthand. Now, as to why these investments are needed, it's because it was not just the technology that those opposite got wrong. They also managed to create an economic mess with a $29 billion cost blowout, thanks to the very puzzling purchase of 60,000 kilometres of new copper. But, Mr Speaker, this government has a clear program underway to ensure that by the end of 2025, 90% of the fixed-line network, some 10 million premises, can access gigabit speeds, which augurs so well for our regions and their ongoing growth.
Call to the acting Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. In January, the Prime Minister promised a $250 million package for Central Australia, which the government claimed would improve community safety, create jobs and improve health services. More than 6 months later, how much of this money has actually been spent?
Order. I give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Can I thank the member for her question and say that the rollout of the $250,000 is going remarkably well. We have upgraded roads and water facilities in outlying communities. We have made available money to a women's service there for who deals with domestic violence. We've increased the funding for the Northern Territory Women's Legal Service in Katherine, which was needing additional money because of the impost on that. We have also made some commitments in terms of education, and we have also spent $25 million on youth services, which, by the way, were running out of money in June under your government.
Has the minister concluded her answer?
Not quite.
Okay. I'll hear from the acting Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, it was a specific question about how much of the $250 million has actually been spent, and I'm comfortable if the minister would like to return to the chamber at a later point to actually outline how much of that $250 million has been spent.
The point of order was on relevance, so I'll go back to my earlier explanation about direct relevance and direct answers aren't the same thing. The minister is that's not a point of order. I'm just explaining the point of order was on relevance, and I'm just asking the minister to continue with her answer because she's talking about the expenditure, she's talking about where it's being allocated and the programs involved.
And I conclude my answer by saying that the rollout has been collaborative. We've established an Aboriginal leaders group in Central Australia to assist the government with that rollout and to listen to those people. And we are doing further work. In fact, I'm going to Alice Springs in 3 weeks' time.
Give the call to the member. The minister has finished her answer. I'll hear from the acting leader on a point of order.
Seeking leave to table a document, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's February media release titled A Better Safer Future for Central Australia, and I assume the Leader of the House will have no objections as he's been tabling.
Okay.
as you've been tabling articles in the public domain all week, may we table?
Order.
In order to assist the minister, return to the House with an exact figure of how much of the $250 million has been spent.
The acting leader is seeking to table a document. That's correct. I'm just go through the normal standard process, and I'll call the leader of the House.
And it's a media release. It's public. Leave's not granted.
Thanks. All right. The next question. I'll call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What does the Royal Commission into Robodebt say about the treatment of vulnerable people in the social security system? And what were the failures to support vulnerable recipients under Robodebt?
Give a call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services. And members on my left will cease interjecting.
I thank the member for Fraser for his question. The concept of vulnerability is important in our social security system. The demographic of Australians who need access to income support payments is wide. It's very varied, but it can include people experiencing physical, psychological, social or cultural disadvantages. Vulnerable people can struggle with understanding, accessing and navigating our social security system, and it's well established that they may require additional support. However, when the Robodebt scheme commenced, the notion of vulnerability was simply trashed. It was thrown overboard. The sort of cohorts of vulnerable people who received no extra support when the scheme started include those in full-time residential care, victims of terrorist incidents, those with intellectual or physical impairment, those fleeing domestic violence, the homeless. Of course, though, in the Royal Commission, the former Coalition Cabinet Minister's defence was essentially one of "no one told us." But why did Coalition ministers need to be told that some Australians are vulnerable? You can hear the woe is me cries of the former Coalition Cabinet Ministers asking, how can we be expected to understand what's happening to hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens? The former Coalition ministers expect us to accept their threadbare defence that they were just following the orders of their public service. They have to accept us they don't read the newspapers, they don't go online, they don't talk to people in the street and they don't hear from the people complaining. It's interesting to note that in 2021, the entire Dutch government resigned after it was found that they had been instituting claims against 20,000 families in Holland, which were based on a fraudulent proposition. Now, before question time, the member Deakin gave a speech. He gave a speech which is destined for the liner of the kitty litter tray of history when he complained that our focus on Robodebt is all politics. Let me explain to the opposition, on behalf of myself and on behalf of Labor. Robodebt is political, but not in the way that's insinuated by those opposite. For Labor, for the Albanese government, for me, it is political when you bully the poor, when you pick on the vulnerable, when you demonise them, when you trash their reputations in the paper. That is political. It's political when you divide this country into those on welfare and those not on welfare. It is political when you seek to divide the country and say that some people are lesser than other people. I say to the Coalition, this issue will never cease for you until you get up and accept what you did wrong, which was bully the poor in this country.
Give the call to the honourable member for Curtin.
This is a question for the Prime Minister. Will your government ban political donations from government contractors?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Yes, thanks, Mr Speaker. The matters of donations to the Australian Labor Party, which I'm responsible for, are matters for the organisational wing of the Australian Labor Party. We've made very clear and transparent decisions over issues including the banning from tobacco companies that we made some time ago. We're the only party of government that has made that decision and carried through with it. I understand the concerns that are raised about political advertising in general. and you would be including donations, including the funding of election campaigns. And the Special Minister of State, my colleague, Senator Farrell, is of course overseeing, and indeed there was inquiry about these issues in the Parliament, and that process is of course ongoing. At the moment in Australia, I know that there's a debate over the funding of election campaigns. It's been there for some time, over whether there should be greater public funding of election campaigns. That, of course, runs up against the fact that that would mean increased costs to taxpayers, and that is the basis of the debate that has gone on. Though it will continue to occur into the future.
The Prime Minister concluded his answer. Give the call to the honourable member for Calwell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. How will recognition through a voice improve outcomes for First Nations Australians, including in the Attorney-General's portfolio?
The call to the Attorney-General. The member for Petrie. I don't care what you're doing, just stop interjecting. Order. The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Calwell for her question. It has been 3 months since this House passed the Constitution alteration proposal. Its passage through the House and the Senate set in train the referendum process, which later this year will allow all Australians to have their say on constitutional recognition of First Nations Australians through a voice. Mr Speaker, we are closer than we have ever been to righting a historic wrong. 120 years of explicit exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in our founding document, the Constitution. Closer to giving our First Peoples a voice. A representative committee that will provide advice to the Parliament and the Executive Government, which does not replace, direct or impede the actions of either. The current approach is broken, and we have a once-in-a-lifetime chance to fix it, to put the right approach in place. Because when you listen to Indigenous Australians about the laws and the policies that affect their lives, you get better outcomes, and we need better outcomes. Nobody who looks at the Closing the Gap statistics can argue that we are doing enough to address the disadvantage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly children. As my colleague, the Minister for Education, has pointed out this week, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to go to jail than to university. This must change. And of course, there's already a great deal of work underway to address these issues, including in my portfolio. But the work can only be enhanced by a greater degree of input from all those it is meant to help. What is there to fear from the simple act of listening to advice? Nothing. Nothing. The voice can do no harm, only good. We know that outcomes are better when we partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. As I've said before, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was issued to the people of Australia, not to government, not to politicians. The Australian people will decide whether to accept its generous invitation to walk together towards a better future. It is a modest ask, but it is an important one. I urge the Australian people to believe that things can be better and to take this chance to make a real and lasting difference.
The call to the member for Braddon.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. One of the elements of the Uluru Statement is, quote, a Makarrata Commission for Agreement Making, and that, quote, Labor will take steps to implement all 3 elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in this term of government. My question, Speaker, will the government negotiate a treaty in this term of government?
Yeah, I was a little lost in that question, but I'll just want to hear from order. I want to hear from the Leader of the House about what was being quoted. Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Yeah, sorry. The point of order is just in any minister trying to make sense of the question. The question made clear it was quoting from something, but kept secret what he was quoting from, which makes it very difficult for a minister to answer or for us to work out whether it's in order.
If I may ask the member for Braddon to state the question again, and perhaps if you're using a quote, to say that source. And
question stands. Will the government negotiate a treaty in this term of government?
Order. That's a different question, but it's within the standing orders. Order. Members on my right, the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the member for Fenner will cease interjecting. And the member for Perth. I'll give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question. I have repeated a number of times this week the priority of this government is a referendum at the end of the year to recognise First Peoples in the Constitution and to make sure that policy and practical outcomes are improved so we can close the gap.
The call to the honourable member for McEwen.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the House. What role has the House of Representatives played in the process that has led to this year's referendum?
Give the call to the Leader of the House.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And it's important to know that the long process of consultation that's led to the referendum later this year has started in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, over various Prime Ministers, has facilitated that process. In 2007, under Prime Minister John Howard, there was a commitment to having some form of constitutional recognition, and the decision was made that the question would be put to First Nations communities, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, as to what form of recognition in the Constitution would make it meaningful. In 2012, under Prime Minister Julia Gillard, this House established a Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition. Then in 2013, under Tony Abbott, that committee was re-established. That led in 2015 to the Kirribilli Statement, and ultimately Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull reported to the House that he'd established the Referendum Council. That led to the House asking for the consultation to happen, where there were 18 regional dialogues, 1,200 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives over 18 months being asked to report back ultimately to this House what form of constitutional recognition they would want that would make constitutional recognition meaningful. Following that dialogue, in 2017 in May, the House was advised of what had happened at the Constitutional Convention of 250 representatives, and those were the representatives who gave the Uluru Statement of the Heart. That followed in 2018, where this House established a Joint Select Committee co-chaired by the member for Barara and Senator Patrick Dodson. And out of that, we ended up with the design principles following the co-design process. During that whole period, there has at the same time been the annual drumbeat of both good intentions and policy failure when we have heard the Closing the Gap report. In all of those reports during that period, we hear what's on track and what's not. The child literacy and numeracy objective has never been on track. The life expectancy objective has never been.
From the notice paper.